Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Zinat Rahman. I am the Executive Director of the Institute of Politics. And thanks for being here tonight for a conversation on the events in Israel, Palestine, and Gaza. In a moment, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jennifer Steinhauer, who will be moderating the discussion today. But first, I just wanted to offer some framing for the conversation. Over the past few weeks, we've been asking ourselves at IOP the question of what IOP's role should be on campus in this moment. And so we did what we often do when in moments like this, which is we turned to our students and we did some deep listening and we heard your suggestions about what you wanted right now. And what we heard over and over is that from so many of you is that you wanted the opportunity to listen and learn about how we arrived at this particular moment. So that's what we're doing tonight. Now, obviously in 75 minutes, we're barely going to scratch the surface of the topic. And we are committed as leadership at IOP to making this be the first of other opportunities for dialogue, for reflection, for learning around this very complex issue throughout the rest of the school year. So stay, in touch with us through our mailing list and stuff as we announce those things. Our goal, as always, is to shed more light than heat on any topic, and that's the task for today, not a small one. And so the questions that you submitted, the format is that Jennifer will host a discussion for 75 minutes. The questions that you submitted through when you registered, she will intersperse through the conversation. And so without further ado, let me turn to our panel, which features writer and political analyst Yousef Munayyer, George Washington University history professor Arie Dubnov, thank you for being here, historian and executive director of the Jerusalem Quarterly Roberto Mazza, and Laila el-Haddad, a Palestinian author and social activist from Gaza. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by our IOP Speaker Series director and fellows director, Jennifer Steinhauer.
Thank you, Zinat. And thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight, and thank you to our guests for traveling here today for this important conversation. So, framing this up, as we all know, the massacre of 1,200 people and hostage-taking in Israel on October 7th was the worst shedding of Jewish blood since the Holocaust, and the Israeli military response has resulted in over 11,000 Palestinian deaths, according to the health ministry in Gaza, a huge number of them children. Acts of anti-Semitism and intimidation toward Jews have escalated across the world, as has Islamophobia, which led to the horribly tragic death of a young child not so far from where we're sitting tonight.
Exactly.
Tensions are high on college campuses, including this one. Friends have found themselves turning against each other, and painful intergenerational conflict has riven many families. Just today, tens of thousands of demonstrators gathered on the National Mall in Washington in what they called a March for Israel, and many American Jews have feared what happened in Israel last month has been erased. A big bipartisan coalition of elected leaders and appointees joined the march, underscoring a notion that many Americans also feel is a baked-in policy bias toward the Israeli government. And hundreds of political appointees and staff members, including many at the State Department, have written to President Biden to denounce his position on Israel. It is a dark time, to say the least, in the Middle East and around the world. The writer and professor that you all know, I'm sure, Peter Beinart, recently wrote, October 7th has really shattered bonds that were forming around a movement for mutual equality and freedom between Jews and Palestinians and other people of conscience. So tonight's discussion is not to resolve or adjudicate the situation, but to try to go deeper in the history than people often talk about. And to gain knowledge that we may not have walked in here having. And if we can, I would like to also try to know more about a question that one of the students submitted that was, why has this conflict so captured the interest of the world, especially compared with other areas of political instability, which is a very worthwhile line of inquiry. And as Zina indicated, your questions that you submitted will be threaded interstitially through the conversation. So I would like to make sure our students all know who we're speaking with. So I would love to start and have you all introduce yourself and maybe perhaps how you center yourself in this conversation.
Thank you. My name is Arie Dubnov. By profession, I'm a historian, born and raised in Israel, teach history at the George Washington University.
I'm Laila el-Haddad.
divided my time between the Gulf and Gaza growing up. My parents were both born and raised in Gaza. My entire family is there. I'm based in Maryland, so all of my work, the bulk of my work, has to do with the intersection of, I would say, culture and politics when it comes to Gaza specifically, and conveying the realities of Palestinians, the everyday realities in Gaza, to the outside world.
So my name is Yousef Munayyer. I write and research on issues of policy related to Israel and Palestine. I happen to be a Palestinian citizen of Israel. I was born inside Israel. My family is dispersed across the entire geography. We have relatives in Gaza, across Israel, in the West Bank, and of course, throughout the region. I grew up primarily in northern New Jersey and live in Washington, D.C., and a father of two.
My name is Roberto Mazza. I'm originally Italian, born and raised. I'm an historian of late Ottoman and British Mandatory Palestine. I'm currently one of the editors of Jerusalem Quarterly, which is a publication of the Institute of Palestine Studies and the host of the Jerusalem Unplugged podcast. I also want to add a layer of the complexity, as my colleagues did. My wife is the Associate Director of the Crown Family Center for Israel and Jewish Studies at Northwestern University. And she's herself an activist and a Mizrahi woman. And I personally lived in East Jerusalem for a number of years on and off, given the difficulties of permits. That's pretty much about it.
Okay, I think we've got all the major religions covered here, mostly. Diaspora. I hope we will have an opportunity to talk to Laila and Yousef a bit about sort of your journey and how you interact when you go into Israel and Gaza, and the different ways that you have to make accommodations just for your family, given different status, legal status. I just want to start a little bit up here before we go deeper to the history, which is when my preparations for this panel, I was listening to, I don't know if you heard the episode of The Daily with David Shipler, who wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book, of course, about the region many decades ago. And in the interview, he called this conflict two clashing narratives, multiple truths, not overlapping at all. And he said, when you go to the Middle East, you see immediately how people are imprisoned by history, especially in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's an arsenal of memory, he said, that gets really chiseled in stone in terms of the way people think about themselves and about their adversaries. And I was wondering, from your various positions, and as you approach this from your personal lived experiences, but also from a historical perspective, if you could reflect on that a little bit.
Right. Well, I guess that sort of, if we start with the history before 1948, which is of course the point that attracts a lot of attention, and for good reasons, and we think about Gaza before there was a Gaza Strip as a city, we won't go back into antiquity and. But most, great number of historians will say, right, the beginning of modern era in the Middle East would be the Napoleon's campaign through Egypt. This also, impacts Gaza. Even Gaza is captured for a short while in 1799. But as we, and it has its own position in kind of the local regional economy. For instance, was main producer of barley. When beer was produced in a modernized way, the Gaza barley was famous, yes. For instance. And fast forward into the World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Of course, the British Empire already sits near Gaza already before World War I. Technically from the late 19th century, the British are controlling Egypt, so it's kind of not too far from Gaza. And during the 3 decades of the British Mandate period, from 1917 until the war of 1948, basically Gaza is in a weird position. It's sort of, on the one hand, for instance, there is an airport of the Royal Air Force is using it. When in the 1930s, the British are starting to propose partitioning Palestine. Gaza is seen as part of the Arabs' future state. Nevertheless, during the 1946 1946, as the partition was again put on the table, this time to the table of the United Nations, and the UNSCOP committee, the UN Special Committee on Palestine, was visiting the region. There were attempts, right, to create some, there was an operation that was called the 11 Points, in which the Zionists were establishing a lot of settlements. Some of the kibbutzim that we saw attacked on October 7th, date back to that period. Some of them were even one point was even in the Gaza Strip near today's Deir al-Balach, and then we can definitely, we will talk about the 1948 war that really changes the contours of the region and really, creates the Strip in a way as we refer to it today. But maybe adding to history also geography, just to understand the scales of the Strip that was created in 1948. It's tiny. It's I'm a runner, for instance. I don't know if there's marathon runners here. You can't run a marathon in Gaza. It's the longest stretch is less than 42 kilometers, right? It's about 40 kilometers. The width is even less. It's roughly 7 miles?
Yeah.
Something like that.
9 miles.
Before we get deep into that, and I do want to go, and I do want to spend some time on British partition, especially in that era, because I think it's really important and a missed piece of this conversation. But if we could get back to the heart of the question, Laila, maybe you could pick up with this about this sense of almost separate narratives, separate histories. Does that resonate with you?
I mean, I can tell you, I can speak from my own, personal experience only. And that's, I can't obviously speak to someone else's experience when you say that it's a set history. What I know as a Palestinian who was born in diaspora, but was always a resident of Gaza, and always was and continues to be stateless in the sense that I knew I belonged somewhere, but was always made to feel a stranger wherever I went. That's the only history I ever knew. And I don't know if you wanted to add something to that. I'm just trying to think of the framing of the question a little bit better.
Yeah, Yousef, because you were living in a little different situation, and you were living. So how do you experience that? Do you experience you were living parallel in different narratives at one time?
I think it's a really interesting question, and a part of me wants to push back a little bit on the idea that this is an exceptional place. And I think it's important for us to always treat those approaches with a great degree of skepticism. What place on earth is not shaped by its history? Where on earth is history not important? And so I think that's important to keep in mind.
And where are there not competing narratives?
And where are there not competing narratives? So I think it's important to keep that in mind. At the same time, there's no denying there is a unique history to this place, and it has shaped the reality that we see today. It's interpreted differently by different communities and differently within those communities. Specifically from the Palestinian perspective, though, I think one thing I would say about this is that, to the extent that Palestinians focus perhaps more than some might expect on historical narratives, it is often a response to the extent to which they find themselves erased from historical narratives. So you often see Palestinians looking back at history to say, no, actually we were there. We did live there. We do have a history there. We do have a connection to this land, and so on and so forth. And so the historical narrative often becomes important in that particular way.
Roberto, I want to move to British Mandate in a second, but I do want to ask you to respond of how you think Israelis would respond to that framing.
Well, it depends on, when we think about the Israelis, that's already part of the problem, right? We were meeting, at this point of time, we were meeting a very polarized Israeli society. So there's kind of admire the IOP for creating the space for dialogue, because this is exactly what collapses in the first victim of these events. But at the same time, part of what happens in these framing is that there is assumption there's like the Palestinian, the Israeli,
like a monolithic,
and in a way, perhaps maybe we'll talk about it later. Part of what the shock among Israelis that the October 7th attack met a highly polarized, divided Israeli society. So I will say that it because then one can speak about sort of a liberal Zionist argument and more the settler religious attitude, and I'll try to play both cards. Mm-hmm. So if liberal Zionists will argue the following thing: the Gaza Strip was never of, for instance, a huge religious significance, right? One can quarrel with religious settlers that they have areas of affinity and that are considered sacred in Hebron, the Cave of the Patriarchs, Jacob Tombs, Hebron, and so on. Gaza in Jewish historical memory doesn't play that role, right? If anything, it's kind of the place where Samson fought the Philistines, right? It's sort of it's not something that goes as deep in history. So and the Zionists, the liberal Zionists often looked at it as a weird place. Nevertheless, it doesn't mean that liberal Zionists after 1967 were not involved in occupying Gaza and so on. The conversations become complicated because in Israel you have also a very kind of a religious settler community that started, treated Gaza in a different way. They, especially later on, we'll talk about the disengagement. So there's a strong narrative among previous settlers that lived in the Gaza Strip that they see this war, as an opportunity to return, and right. Just kind of use the language of return. And this is kind of a part of the inner debate among Israeli Jews. It doesn't mean, so in a way I would even say that part of what we see today is kind of even among the Israelis that agree that sort of that will say that this is a unnecessary war. Some will say it's a war of self-defense. Others are using the language of return and conquest.
I'm glad you bring up this, and I want everyone to hold in their mind this question we'll return to about these just internal disagreements, and especially what really strikes me is that there is a lot of intergenerational disagreement with American Jews, for sure, perhaps in Israel, as you've alluded to, and maybe among Palestinians. I would love to hear more about that. But why don't we go back in time a little bit to the first half of the 20th century, which was a turbulent, violent time: Russian Revolution, 2 world wars, then it's the British Mandate period, and I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, anyone on this panel, but the one thing I think Israeli Jews and Palestinians can agree upon is that was a period of deep unhappiness. that was not a time people looked back on fondly. So can you put Israel and Palestine, Roberto, in context of the British Mandate period internationally?
Well, first of all, we have to go back to the period of World War I. So I guess many will know that on November 2nd, 1917, as part of a propaganda campaign, really, the British published the famous or infamous, depending on the point of view, I guess, Balfour Declaration, which essentially promised the Jews a land, well, they called it a national home in Palestine. National home doesn't mean anything. It was vague in terms of defining what was promised to the Jews. On the other hand, what really this document did was to already create expectations, because the British promised civic, but more importantly, national rights for the Jews. Whereas for the Palestinians, for the indigenous population, using the negative language, so the non-Jewish population, which is a very interesting exercise in linguistic approach to the document, they talk about civic and religious rights. So if there's an element of partition that goes already from that promise. Now, we can't read history backwards and say partition was decided in 1917, but the seeds, and obviously everything could have changed in time, are already there in a sense. And that was the very beginning. But more importantly, if we really want to place that land internationally, obviously for the British, this becomes the land of Palestine, Eretz Israel, as it's called by the Jews, becomes part of the British Empire. So it's this tiny little area of the British Empire, I think, is comparable to the size of New Jersey. People like look in America, look at that. This worldwide empire which stretched from Canada to India, and it's an important part of the British Empire, mostly because of Haifa, and then after the discovery of oil in Mesopotamia, then to become Iraq, obviously that becomes a strategic port. But what is interesting is that despite the promises, the British, keep their eyes open to how events unfold. And here I think it's important to add the element and the power of the Zionists, plural, and the various forms of Zionism, still yet plural, because there's not such a thing as a one consolidated Zionism. I'm sure Arie can speak more about it. But they are able to take advantage of British rule in Palestine. First of all, and again, this is very important from a legal perspective, Zionists are able to add the Balfour Declaration to the mandate. Mm-hmm. And that essentially is making the promise legal, but more importantly, that's the moment where the Zionists go to the British and say, and knock at the door, now you really have to do your part, which is to promote Jewish Zionist immigration into Palestine and allow, us to develop in this land. But this is not happening with the Palestinians. And I think this is also the beginning of this unequal development. So again, it's a form of partition. In 1937, it's put on a map. But economically, politically, then we see the elements of partition. And this is mostly fostered by the British. And again, it didn't have to go like that. History is not preconceived, predetermined. We have the advantage point of looking backwards. But everything could have changed. And again, I like to stress the point that there's a lot of debates within the Zionists during the British mandate. What is that exactly we want to do? Mm-hmm. Is it a cultural rebirth? Do we want the land? Do we want all of it? Shall we try to coexist with the Arabs? Should we learn Arabic? So it's something that still, can be shaped.
Can I just add on to this? Because I feel like there's something very important that you put your finger on with this distinction that starts with the Balfour Declaration and I think really animates a lot of Western approaches to this issue through this day. Mm-hmm. And that's this idea of self-determination, effectively being seen as something that the Jewish people are entitled to, but the Palestinians are not. And you hear it in the language of the Balfour Declaration. You see it in the partition plans. From the Western perspective, either in the days of the British Mandate or through today, but especially in those days in Europe, Jews were seen as a distinct people that didn't fit into European society, and we understand that history. Palestinians were seen as part of an amorphous blob of Arabs that did not necessarily have a distinct connection to this land and could be sliced and diced into different parts of it or maybe outside of it to accommodate this issue of Jewish self-determination. And I think that fundamental imbalance has really shaped Western approaches to Israel and Palestine for the last century.
Did you want to add to that?
I agree with everything that was said. I will just add another dimension. The Balfour, one thing that to be mentioned about the Balfour Declaration is it's a wartime document, and horrible as it may sound, the British are issuing it before they even enter Jerusalem, actually when they're engaged in fighting over Gaza. It's during the third battle on Gaza that the Balfour Declaration is issued in November 1917. I just want to add another layer. It doesn't contradict anything that was said here, but it's the international, so part of what happens in the Balfour Declaration and the interwar period between the two world wars is also the birth of what we call today an international order. And part of what makes the period so complicated, but maybe it's important in the context of contemporary conversations, is that the mandate system is sort of a double-headed kind of a system, right? So there is a new entity called the League of Nations in Geneva, the predecessor of today's UN. And there's an attempt kind of to say this is not an old type of empire. We're not calling it formally a colony. It's some sort of a weird position and mandate is kind of preparing the population towards some sort of a self-government, but it's not clear. There's no clear expiration date. It's not clear. And part of what makes that period very complicated is that, as Roberto mentioned, it's kind of the documents of the period are full of open-ended phrases and text can be interpreted in numerous ways, right? Even the Balfour Declaration, it's a national home. It's not a republic. It's not a state. It's not a protectorate. It's nothing that we know. I mean, you even, in German they had to invent a new word for it, Heimstätte, right? So it's a lot of it in that period. Is a text that are open to interpretation, and it's definitely part of the struggle of that period. Is that who provides political muscle to these kind of promises?
Well, I mean, and we'll stipulate, right, without going into each period of time, that the history of this region is riddled with bloody massacres, both sides. We stipulate that. I want to talk about 1948 and partition because it's fair to say Jews accepted this plan, as you sort of intimated. Arab community did not. And from there, Palestinians were expelled deliberately, as we know, a lot by Israeli forces, which at the time some of that we know was denied and later uncovered. Some fled because they were afraid they'd be massacred. Others were fled because they were urged by the other Arab states to do that, right? And then there was this whole period of multiple interactions and skirmishes until we get to, I would like to move up to the Six-Day War of 1967, when Israel took over those large swaths of land from Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, followed the Camp David Accords. And that seems to shift the conflict specifically around the issue of Palestinians about that time and period, correct? So can we pause for a second to go back to the question of the West Bank and Gaza? Because I think a lot of people who don't know a lot about these issues can want to know what is the difference between these two regions, and it's quite important, right, to delineate that.
Can I just say something about what you said? I found very interesting. And I want to digress, but I think it's important for people to understand that there have been massacres between 1920 and 1948. But I think we should focus on the fact that in between those massacres, actually, there's been a lot of work done also to bridge communities. And certainly 1929 was very important in defining the relation between the Jews and the Arabs. Nevertheless, the day after, they went back to work. I mean, in a sense that I think it's important to reflect that violence happened, there was the conditions. Violence was a political language through which these groups communicated with each other and with the British, particularly 36 to 39. But I think it's important to focus on all of the large gaps between this eruption of violence, which, tell us that actually there were multiple avenues. Again, nothing was predetermined. That violence was not inherent and it was not there ready to outbreak it somehow. So I think that's important because also it helps us to understand, what happened then after 48 when we look at Gaza and the West Bank.
Well, perhaps also we can return to that at the end of the conversation when we start to look forward. If you see any maps, any clues in those pieces of history that light any path forward.
I just want to briefly, not to detract from the conversation, underscore how seminal 1948 was for Palestinians, because I feel like we kind of brushed over that a little bit. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, including my husband's own family, were either forced to flee or expelled, much as we see, history repeating itself right now in Gaza. Many of them, including my husband's family, by Zionist militia like the Irgun and others. His family happened to be from northern historic Haifa, and he still has part of the family that was able to stay. But for to make it relevant for the purposes of today's conversation, many of those Palestinians were forced to flee to what would eventually become known as the Gaza Strip. And we keep hearing that the majority of Palestinians in Gaza are refugees. And what that means is in 1948, many of them ended up seeking safety in the closest city to them, which was Gaza, which was not the Gaza Strip, which was one of many British administrative districts at the time, known as the Gaza District, thinking, of course, they would be allowed back once the war ended, which was not the case. And so that influx tripled Gaza's population overnight. And now 80% of the modern-day residents of the Gaza Strip, of course, are Palestinians who don't consider modern-day Gaza their home, who are actually from that area that we hear in the news a lot referred to as the Gaza envelope. So,
And thank you for kind of defining the refugees, because I think that's confusing to people. That Gaza's been here this long time, so why do we refer to it? Yeah. And it's fair to say,
or refugees or descendants of those refugees from 1940.
Fair enough. And I don't want to dwell on 1948, but it's fair to say that that is the heart of the question that I started with, which is the essential different interpretations of that maybe the most seminal year, maybe not, I don't know, for this question I began with about how people view their own history and their history, and even out in the diaspora as it pertains to that moment. It's fair to say that there would be people who would view, Israelis would view that differently.
Well, yeah, I mean, so many of the debates nowadays are kind of debates about, where to begin, right? 1948, 1967, right. We even didn't mention a brief skirmish in the middle, which is the 1956 war that Gaza was briefly conquered.
Yes, my mother actually was a survivor of that. She was from Khan
And I will mention it in the context of today's conversation just briefly, because it was conquered briefly by Israel, and Israel was forced to withdraw from those areas because of American pressure. I flew in from Dulles International Airport, and Dulles was the one saying to Ben Gurion, that's occupied territory, move back. So that's kind of apropos history. But definitely 1967 is a landmark watershed moment. From work of recent historians that on the Israeli side that were looking at declassified documents, you saw those debates within the Israeli government during the time of Levi Eshkol and Golda Meir, what exactly to do. Once now, Gaza was conquered, and there's like a famous exchange between Levi Eshkol and Golda, and Golda is asking Eshkol, so what do we do now with what was then million Palestinian refugees? And Eshkol, in his kind of classic kind of a euphemistic way, says, oh, I understand you're interested in the brewery, but not in the bride. Sort of you were interested in the territory, but you don't know what to do with the population. And you see that there is like debate and different policies, attempts to either encourage Palestinians to immigrate, to resettle, and part of what is taking place at those first years is also an economic shift, sort of a Moshe Dayan's open door policy, as it was called then, wanted to make kind of a turn Gaza into kind of a dependent on the Israeli economy. I want to mention it. It's important, especially for the young members of the audience, which is the great majority here. When I grew up in Israel, the figure of the Palestinian worker, either usually in construction or in agriculture, was something you saw. You went to a restaurant in Tel Aviv, right? It's kind of one can compare it, as odd as it may sound, when you see Latinos in California. The owner of the restaurant is white, but who's doing the dishes and who's waiting the table? That was the reality in Israel. That is connected to policies, economic policies, that basically up to the 90s. And we can talk later on about why it changed, but without even going into the details of economic history, part of the effect is that Israelis of your age, as opposed to me, that I'm stating my age here, never had that experience. So I'm not saying, don't misunderstand me as if I'm portraying Israel between 1967 and 90s as a beautiful, liberal place, but I'm saying that people rubbed shoulders, right? I have a good friend, his dad was a constructor, worked in construction in Ashkelon, the city next to Gaza. Every morning he will come, pick up, a couple of vans with Palestinian workers. This all changed. So they spoke Arabic to each other, they intermingled. And part of what we see nowadays, that is not the only reason, but part of the really the demonization of each side is that even that reality that is in itself very asymmetrical, very unequal, even that disappeared in the 90s and definitely after the
a lot of interaction between, Israelis, including Israeli settlers that used to live in Gaza that I interviewed, would frequently tell me how they would go to Gaza to purchase fish and get medical treatment and it sounds bizarre to think about that now, and to purchase furniture, because Gaza is, of course, historically, a trading city known for its many things, its textiles, and it's not historically a destitute city. That was by design. But I do want to just note a couple of things, though. First of all, I know you touched briefly on 1956, but for, it's a younger audience interested in learning more about that. I encourage you to read Joe Sacco's Footnotes in Gaza. Amazing, excellent. And that will really give you a lot of context for what going on today. But just I want to touch briefly, yes, there was a lot of interaction, but the reality is, there was still a brutal repression, and we're talking specifically about Gaza in the 1970s. The beginning of kind of this tone of Israeli repression, theme of Israeli repression vis-a-vis Gaza, I would say started in the 1970s, arguably before with Unit 101, but in the 1970s when Ariel Sharon tried to pacify any resistance in Gaza, specifically in Gaza's refugee camps. You see sort of history repeating itself. And ordered the summary execution of 1,000 Palestinians that he suspected to be involved in any kind of resistance, what were referred to as Palestinian Fidaiyin, and flattened more than large swaths of areas within the Palestinian refugee camps of Beach Camp, Shalta, and Jabalia, and destroyed over 600 homes. So that kind of marked, I would say, the beginning. In this, even though there was this interaction, there was still, on the other hand, this brutal repression and pacification of any kind of resistance by the Israelis vis-a-vis Palestine.
And so in these parallel worlds, Israel has interstitially but consistently always felt, correct me if I'm wrong, a threat to its existence since that period. And not from, as per se, from its interactions with what's going on in Gaza, but the broader surrounding Arab area.
So it's a good question. I'm not sure. In a way, I think you're absolutely right. It's very important to return to the 70s and when Ariel Sharon in general, in the history of Gaza, Ariel Sharon plays a huge role. He eclipses a lot. And he plays almost from an Israeli point of view like a dual role, because he's both the architect of a very brutal military oppression and the settlement in Gaza that was then called the Five Fingers Plan. So that was a plan of let's settle Jews between the big urban centers so that Palestinians could not spread. And that created what the Israelis called Gush Katif. These are the settlements on the Gaza Strip. But it will be the same person that, not out of care of Palestinians, would then, in 2005, decide one-sided disengagement. I'm pulling out, removing all the settlers, locking the gates on Gaza, throwing the key to the Mediterranean, to use a metaphor. So in a way, Ariel Sharon, plays a huge role in the history of Gaza. And you'd say, and you use the very charged phrase, existential threat. So I know that today people are using it, and for obvious reasons. I think that part of what, and this is kind of zooming out to the Israeli, not only Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but Israeli-Arab conflict. Mm-hmm. You have to remember that up to 1973, there was Israel was still engaged in conventional warfares, a conventional military against a conventional military. Up to October 7th, the biggest scar for Israelis in their history was the 1973 October War after the 1948 war. It was still a conventional war between the Israeli, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, and the armies of Egypt and Syria. what we see from 1973 onwards is numerous skirmishes that are always these asymmetrical fights between kind of Israel and what the Israelis would call kind of guerrilla forces and so on. And then kind of we will have to somehow fast forward to the First Intifada, where kind of the split between PLO and creation of Hamas, and that's kind of plays a big role in the realities unfolding today.
Can we pause, Roberto, on the Christians living in that region and what role they play? I think, didn't you tell me that there was even involvement of a Catholic leader who proposed to exchange himself for Israeli hostages? We kind of skip over another group living in and interacting with Israel, inclusive of, by the way, from a different angle, evangelical Christians in the United States who have played a pivotal role in the relationship between the U.S. In contemporary history in Israel. Can you reflect on that a little bit?
I want to start with the evangelicals, just because today there was a march, a pro-Israel march, which saw the presence of the famous evangelical pastor John Hagee, I hope I pronounce him well, who became very famous in 2005, complaining against Ariel Sharon that he was leaving Gaza, because obviously evangelicals believe, and I know this is like a bit of a stretch if you're not familiar, but evangelicals believe in the second coming of Jesus, which requires the Jews to be transferred in their entirety to the land of Israel. Then that will start the second coming, but that's another story. But I think it was very important because, that moment in time also pushed evangelicals to become more active politically in the US and creating connection with Israel in order to avoid similar situation and actually to start sending direct aid to the settlers, mostly in the West Bank. So this is one aspect of Christian involvement in Israel. And I underline, this is the evangelicals. If we think about Gaza today, there are only around 2,000 Christians in Gaza, split almost equally between Greek Orthodox and Catholics, so we are going back to the old denomination. The Greek Orthodox Church was bombed, St. Porphyrius was bombed and destroyed a couple of weeks ago. The Holy Family Parish is still active and is run by a good friend, Gabriel Romanelli. Despite the Italian name, actually he's a Spanish speaker, obviously he speaks Arabic, and he's leading a congregation of around 1,000 Catholics who had been there for a very long time. They are almost powerless, and they've been even more powerless since they take over of Hamas in 2007, and their role has become minimal. However, it is fair to say that unlike regular Gazans, they enjoyed few more privileges, again, mostly due to Vatican pressure on Israel to let some of these Gazans travel outside the Gaza Strip. And so that brings me to a point, if you're not familiar with Vatican diplomacy, that's often, it operates through back channels. So about 3 weeks ago, the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, who is currently an Italian, he offered himself in exchange of the hostages. And many, starting with Arie, we had this conversation online, and many were surprised. And I was like, well, no, actually, it's a tradition of the Catholic Church. There's plenty of examples, and I'm going to make a couple. One was in 1978 when the Red Brigades, which was a terrorist organization in Italy, kidnapped a very important politician, and the Pope offered himself. But this goes also back to different periods of time. There is a saint in the Catholic Church, Maximilian Kolbe, who offered himself to the Nazi in exchange of Jews, which was mostly children and women, to be killed in their place. And then there's plenty. So it was not a surprise, but it must be said that, in other contexts it worked, but in the Palestinian-Israeli context, Vatican diplomacy has been, generally speaking, fairly weak. In fact, there's always been a lot of tension between Israel and the Vatican, mostly because of, the expansion of the Catholic Church throughout, obviously, the Palestinians, and also because of the opening of an Hebrew-speaking Catholic Church in Israel, which is called the Vicariate of St. James. And like in Beersheba, they have a church, which I attend. The language spoken is Hebrew. The majority of the people attending church are either Palestinians who migrated from mostly the north to Beersheba, and obviously caregivers. Filipinos, Indians, and we saw some of them being kidnapped by Hamas on October 7th. So it's a reality also, this immigration into Israel, and they do occupy a place which is often neglected and forgotten.
Can I just tack on a couple of things in relation to a few things that were said? First, I just want to make sure for everyone who may not be aware, because I'm not sure it was clear in the conversation about this as it was discussed, but the Christian community in Palestine is an inseparable part of the Palestinian fabric.
Absolutely.
And it always has been, and it's deeply rooted within the history of the land for millennia. And so I just wanted to make that point clear. I also want to say something about this notion of an existential threat, because I think there are different ways to understand this. There is an existential threat in terms of sort of military power, right? But then there's this existential threat to the Zionist project, which is an idea. And this is something that is very different. Militarily speaking, Israel today, and for a long time, is significantly more powerful than any of its immediate rivals. It has peace with a number of its neighbors. It has nuclear weapons and first and second strike capabilities. As a military power, it's pretty secure and doesn't face an existential threat today. As an idea, though, the Zionist project has from the very beginning put itself in a very precarious place in Palestine, because it defined its goal as being an ethno-majoritarian state in a space where most of the people were not from that group. And that has always been a threat to the idea that I think continues to this day, and animates a lot of policy among Israeli decision makers, including ones who are making decisions about what is to happen with the population in Gaza today, what is to happen with the population in the West Bank, and yes, what is to happen with Palestinian citizens of Israel. And if you hear some of the most esteemed historians of 1948, like Benny Morris, for example, talk about that moment. In his interview with Haaretz in the mid-2000s, he said, look, we made a mistake in 1948 because we didn't finish the job. The lesson from 1948 was not that ethnic cleansing was a problem, but that Israel didn't do a thorough enough job. And so the existence of Palestinians is the existential threat to the Zionist project, not to the safety of the Jewish community, but to the Zionist idea. That fundamental problem has not been resolved.
But doesn't that creation come from its own genocide, the genocide that was perpetrated against Jews, obviously during the Holocaust? I mean, that was the seed of it, right? Of that particular time period.
So, if I may, I think that there are two things that are taking place simultaneously. Right, about existential threat, I think that, yes, I agree with Israel's capabilities as a military. In this specific moment, one of the reasons that the Israelis were, I don't think they were completely hysterical for no reason. It's like, that's the Woody Allen saying, the fact that I'm paranoid doesn't mean that no one is chasing after me. Sort of, it's the potential of that local conflict to escalate. So I agree. I don't think the Israeli military fears that the Hamas is as powerful as to conquer entire Israel, but how it might escalate and northern, a war in the northern border with Lebanon, if Iran will be involved, the situation is horrific, catastrophic. Perhaps it could have been even more catastrophic. So I don't know, and this is something that we need to speculate about in I don't know, 50, 70 years from now, when the documents from now will be declassified. So I think about specific moment now, it's not, I do have a lot of friends in the Israeli kind of post-Zionist, anti-Zionist peace community, they felt existential threat because of the specific circumstances in which the specific, events of October 7th were unfolded, and the potential that it will go. And this is kind of a more, I'll call it Brookings Institute type of conversations, right? We are also living in a moment that sometimes people call it the post-Cold War moment, and the reason that all eyes are set on the region is also because what are the implications, right? Saudi Arabia and US and so on. I don't want to go in there, but that's part of the reason in this specific moment people did have a real feel of existential threat. As for kind of the Zionist project and how after 1948, definitely it's based on the idea of a demographic majority and minority. I as a scholar of the historian of partition, I'm the first one to agree with that. That's kind of it's not contradicting your comment or question. Sort of a part of what happened in 1947-8 is that the UN accepted, sort of Resolution 181 was accepted by United Nations. So the basic premise, right, of how the area would be formulated was based on an idea of partition, and it created more, I would argue, more problems than it solved it. I will emphasize in that respect that for specifically about Gaza, so of course within the Zionist movement there was those who accepted partition, because partition would be the way for the Zionists to say at least we secured some sort of a small state, and those who from day one said it's a tiny set land and they expired the greater land of Israel. But again, specifically about Gaza, it was not imagined until relatively recently in history as kind of this is the greater, one could have been Zionist with saying there's no interest in invading into Gaza. I would even argue the following, that actually if you look at Israeli culture, and this is where popular culture sometimes is helpful, Gaza is kind of this, what scholars like Foucault will call it heterotopy. So this is the complete otherness. It's a problem the way Israelis imagined Gaza. Gaza represented the exact opposite from Israel. Israel was imagined as modern, technology, democracy. Gaza was always the image, even to the degree that you will sometimes find Palestinian citizens of Israel that are saying, if they're feeling uncomfortable about someone who's maybe too, clerical, send him to Gaza, right? That kind of an image of Gaza. Do you
remember what Rabin famously said in 1988?
Specifically about Gaza? No.
He said, "I wish I would wake up and find that the sea swallowed Gaza whole."
Right. So that was kind of always imagined as that other, right? It's and so I'm not saying that to appease it, but part of what we see now. Again, to go back to my earlier comment, that among the Israelis themselves, you have those who are saying that's our opportunity to conquer and create, and it goes really to those who are saying, talking with, not choosing careful words, and they're talking explicitly about Nakba 2.0. They're like Israeli politicians who are saying this. And others are saying, what do we need to do there?
We're going to run out of time, and I want to make sure we get to the paths forward. But we've been talking about this as a land dispute for most of this conversation, and we've been careful not to frame this as a religious conflict. And I want to ask two questions, and it's difficult, both of these questions, and they're asked them in two different kinds of ways. The first way is, I would say, to a viewer of videos, and I'm going to specifically say non-Muslim, but maybe also, but definitely not non-Muslim viewers, looking at a Hamas gunman shouting Allahu Akbar before they kill people, suggests this is not a war of territory, but more of a religious conflict, which feels underscored by Jews who are having protests outside a synagogue or being protested in Jewish spaces. That seems to define them as part of the Israel government, the Israel problem. So I would like to hear how you would contextualize that. And the flip side of this, and this is a student question, is how does one question Israel's actions without being labeled anti-Semitic? And those two, I asked those questions together because I think they're both important framings and both important ways of looking at this? Yousef?
Well, I would say first, when it comes to Palestinian acts of violence, it's resistance to Israel, whatever Palestinian is behind it, comes in all different stripes, ideological stripes, political stripes. It is not just among political Islamists, and the Palestinian political spectrum is broader than that. And it has existed long before political Islam became a significant factor in Palestinian political politics, which I think tells you that it is not about religion that is driving it, but religion can become a vehicle for expressing these things in certain situations. But it is not the root of the issue. Does that make sense?
Right. Well, long before Hamas was on the scene, of course, we had Fatah, we had the DFLP, we had largely secular and socialists.
Right, who were not screaming Allahu Akbar. And, I think also religious language is used in a lot of different contexts and conflicts that are not about religion. And, again, would push back on the exceptionalizing of the space and the exceptionalizing of sort of conflict in Muslim spaces as being, uniquely defined by religion. I think if we looked at the Battle Hymn of the Republic, for example, we would find a lot of religiously animated language. That doesn't mean that it was a conflict over religion, right? So. We have to look at the entire context to sort of understand these things.
But do you look at October 7th as a Palestinian resistance moment?
I think that it is a part of a very bloody and violent history of a system of violence that predates October 7th, continues through this day, and will continue on until it is fundamentally addressed.
And how do you must have engaged with your Jewish friends or Israeli friends who would view that differently? How do you have that conversation?
I have it the same way that I've had it before October 7th. I have been a proponent of human rights and a just solution in this space long before October 7th because I don't want to see moments like that. Because I don't want to see the moments that we're seeing in Gaza, and because I understand that these moments are an inevitable function of a system of violence that until it is addressed with a just solution are going to continue. And so we can't just address these moments when they happen. We have to be realistic about why they occur, how they occur, to make sure that they don't happen again.
Well, the way that Israel decides it won't happen again is the current actions that we see in Gaza.
I would say that that's a pretty naive approach.
Mm-hmm. It's myopic, yeah.
Yeah, you look at, for example, I'll just give you an example. The 3 founders of Hamas all lived through the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948. They all witnessed massacres in Gaza as they were growing up.
Arie, what is your response to that?
Well, I think that there's a few things that are, I think that context is, I'm the first one to agree that context is crucial. I think sort of the situation, the powder keg that exploded on October 7th, too many people on both sides were warning that this is the blockade on Gaza would create a situation that is explosive, and so I agree with this completely. I would even say that it's not a statement of a Israeli radical lefty or a peacenik. It actually, if you examine or ask ex-senior officers that were looking at this blockade and how you keep entire population on almost starving, they warned that might explode in our faces. So I agree on respect as well. I think that the spectacle of violence and the language of violence, I think, was in the Israeli side does seen as a watershed moment, both because of the scales of the atrocities, also as a historian we all know that media has an effect, so it was such a televised massacre, but also the burning of bridges, right? So this is where a lot of the Israeli progressive or lefty colleagues and friends felt betrayed, right? Sort of that suddenly bonds of solidarity dissipated very quickly, right? Sort of a group of feminists that were working side by side, Jews and Palestinians, suddenly, rape of Jewish women is not considered a problem, right? Sort of, and that's kind of this is part of what made October 7th, and one of the many reasons, and of course the way, because of the Israeli education and Jewish memory, it was very quickly connected with memories of Holocaust and extinction. So again, these are emotions. You cannot reason with them, but you can understand why they're, where they're coming from. It's not coming out of nowhere. I think that part of the challenging moment we're living in is that, I will say, it will sound very blunt, sort of on both sides, they're religious extremists. I'm the first one to say that there's a very dangerous religious extremist section that unfortunately is part of an ultra-right government in Israel today, and I think that they are dangerous. So I think that Israelis do have the responsibility to the Hebrew saying is bi'alta et hara mikirbecha, take out the bad within your group. I mean, maybe part of the problem of the conflict is it's so asymmetrical that kind of asking Palestinians to do right, as we deal, we need to deal with the problems within our side that Palestinians will shake off. That's part of the problem we're basing. And I'm not saying that the Israelis are doing a good job, right? 40 weeks of demonstrations against Netanyahu, and still he's in power, right? So I'm not saying that even in conditions that are more favorable, it's not that easy to shake off.
We only have about 10 minutes, which is hard to unpack one state versus two state options, but, and those are not the only framings. And Yousef, you've had different ideas that you've expressed about this. And again, you're someone who, your family lives in, even with your own nuclear family, you have different papers, different ways that you travel in and out of the region. So you have a firsthand account of the split, of almost a split life. I would like everyone on this panel to take the last minutes that we have to see what type of path, take a few minutes to see your own pathway forward, what is realistic, and is there any possible, even imaginable, after what has happened and in the history of this region, to return to any of those moments that you all described to be in individual points in your own collective consciousness of living in some form of peace in that region between these two groups of people?
Should I start?
Go ahead.
With the biggest question? Yeah.
And mindful of the time, so everyone
yes,
gets...
it's right there. I want to pick up with something that Arie said, and also something that you mentioned at the very beginning about narratives. And, already those narratives divided Israeli among themselves and Palestinian and Israeli, and sometimes even Palestinians among themselves. Because the reality is that, depending whether you're a Palestinian from Gaza, from the West Bank, from East Jerusalem, different educational systems, different narratives that are taught. And these are all elements that have been taken into account, even thinking about how we're going to move forward. So I'm thinking about, for instance, what happened in Northern Ireland. One of the things that brought peace, relatively peace, moving forward was about reconciliation. But it's very hard at the moment. I mean, again, looking at my family in Israel, I don't hear words of reconciliation. And most of these people are Arab speakers, They work with Palestinians. They live in Beersheba, so it's really, lower class. But at the moment, there is no room whatsoever to even engage in any conversation about what's next.
Right.
And so, that's one side. And the other problem is about leadership. Israelis have created their own problems in the past 15 years with Bibi Netanyahu undermining the PA and keeping talking to Hamas and essentially getting to this place. And using the myth that was created by Ehud Barak, who are we talking to? Who are the Palestinians, the good Palestinians that we can talk to? They created their own problems now. And obviously Netanyahu has no interest whatsoever to engage with Palestinians of any sort because according to him and to the government, there's no one there that can be a reasonable Palestinians to talk to. And so, right-wing governments, they found this huge prairie. And honestly, I don't see anything other than it really comes from an international community, but even then, it's super biased. You can see the inequality. So honestly, it's very hard to see a path forward.
Yousef?
Yeah, first let me just say thank you guys. I know this is a very hard conversation to try to all smush into, the limited time that we have, and we are not going to do justice to the answers to this question. So I have written extensively on this. I would encourage you all to check out a piece that I wrote if you're interested in my perspective in foreign affairs on a one-state outcome. I still believe that is the only alternative to unending violence that we have been seeing, even if it seems further away in this moment than ever. I think one of the implications of this moment is going to be that the one-state reality that has been so deeply entrenched will only be further entrenched. I don't see Israel becoming any more willing after this to back away from any Palestinian territory, nor do I see it immediately inclined to make any changes in its policies towards Palestinians when it comes to partition or anything like that. That's going to be the wake of this moment whenever it ends, and we are going to have to find ourselves looking for a solution born out of that reality. I personally believe that Israelis and Palestinians are stuck living with each other. People may not like that. We can blame the British if we want. That's the reality, okay? The question is, how do we find a system that respects the rights of all people within this space to security, to freedom, to democracy, to equal rights, so that you create the conditions where political violence is least likely? I think that looks like a one-state democratic outcome. I know people have different views on that, but that continues to be where I'm at.
And in a government with proportional representation where Palestinians in Israel have, roughly 20% of the vote, I would say, right? Is that about accurate?
20% of the population.
That is not a complete fantasy, obviously. We're talking, I know that your framing became before the events of October 7th. Laila?
One, it's important to remember that Palestinians now in numbers are equal to those of Palestinian Muslims, and Christians are equal to numbers of Jewish Israelis if one takes into account the entirety of the land. And I think we already have de facto a one-state solution right now. It just happens to be an apartheid reality. And so I think Israel needs to decide, does it want to be a democratic nation state with equal rights for all, or does it want to continue to be an ethno-majority apartheid state? And I think that the reality on the ground is going to dictate those decisions. I can speak from the reality on the ground for my own family, for example, that applies to multiple other Palestinian families. My own husband can't travel with me when I'm able to travel to Gaza, and I can only do that through the Rafah crossing in Egypt. And when we are there, so he can't join me, and this applies against tens of thousands of Palestinian families, we wouldn't be able to go from Gaza to the West Bank. Right. Palestinians in Bethlehem, 10 minutes away from Jerusalem, can't go pray in Jerusalem without Israeli approval, which is only given to a very small percentage of the population. And Palestinian refugees on the outside cannot, of course, go back in. And I could go on and on and on. Palestinians within the West Bank are divided from one another. When you said the five-finger plans, I think the same applies then to the West Bank, hundreds of Palestinians, towns and villages divided from one another. This is the reality on the ground for Palestinians, and until that violent system of apartheid is addressed, then there is no path forward. But I think that reality is going to dictate the decisions that Israel faces.
Arie, I'd be interested in your opinion too, but also I assume you're talking to your family. I think you have family who were on one of the kibbutz that were infected here. So I'm curious what you're hearing, not so much your opinion, although I'm always interested in your opinion, but not with 236. So I'd be interested to hear what you're hearing from your family and friends in Israel and how they view it at this point.
So I think that, that's maybe the gap between there are a lot of great plans on the table. So that's part of that's the difference between history and political science. There are great political plans, and I'll connect it to both the type of community I know that savagely among the kibbutzim on the Gaza border, as weird as it may sound, there were a lot of people that were actually very much involved in the peace community. It was kind of so you will find, it might sound surprising that from the communities that were most affected, you will hear some of the most bold voices saying, ceasefire, don't against indiscriminate killing, not to use language of revenge. I think that yes, from my wife's side, I have family in one of those kibbutzim, kibbutz Mefalsim. Luckily, in that kibbutz was relatively, the standby squad fended off the attackers on the fences of the kibbutz, so they were not able to go house by house and massacre people, but people are deeply traumatized, and they know families and friends and that were kidnapped and killed. I think that perhaps, to use my, somehow I had my final word that was not planned. As a historian, I'm studying the Ichud group, that was a group of intellectuals in the late 40s that were thinking about some sort of a federal or confederal solution to Palestine. The ideas were great. It was always the problem. There was need a campaign for hearts of minds, and then the war of 1948 opened, and these ideas went to the dustbin of history that I'm recovering. So maybe that's my kind of a feeling. There's a great plans out there, but we need a campaign of hearts of minds so that it will be the will to bring them forward.
And it's not the moment, really. I think people are thinking much beyond those plans. I want to thank all of you for being here. This was a difficult conversation. I don't know how you all experienced it. I experienced it that way. I felt moments myself as a narrator of this conversation, discomfort. I felt angry at some of the things I heard tonight. I also felt very reflecting and trying to put myself sort of in the position of every single person on this panel, and being aware of my own biases and my own narrative in this history, which is what we kind of started with, that everybody brings a piece of narration and personal history into this conversation, even people who have nothing to do with the region, even many people who have decided to kind of center their own political beliefs in a situation they might not even know much about 6 months ago. So I appreciate you coming and trying to do this. I hope that we continue to have conversations across campus. I think I really respect the way you were all able to speak together and with me and before this audience, and I just really appreciate your time, and thank you so much.
Thank you.